Summary of Beautiful Boy by David Sheff. In the beginning of Beautiful Boy, the author David Sheff talks about how he wanted to tell the story of his son Nick's addiction use. He hopes it will help people with addiction or who have a loved one with addiction find comfort or direction. Nick is born on July 20, 1982, in Berkeley, California, to David and Vicky, who are married. But when Nick is 3, David falls in love with a family friend, and he and Vicky get a divorce. David stays in the Bay Area, while Vicky moves to Los Angeles. Nick starts to move between them when he is 5 years old. He spends the school year with David and the summer and holidays with Vicky. Nick has a hard time with his parents' divorce because he feels torn between them. Nick's teachers at school say that he is smart and a leader. He loves to write, surf, and listen to music. David gets married again to a woman named Karen when Nick is 8 years old. They leave San Francisco and move to a more rural place called Inverness right before Nick starts 6th grade. In December 1993, Nick's younger brother Jasper is born. Nick starts to feel some of the pressures of being a teenager as he goes through middle school. David finds a small bag of marijuana in Nick's backpack and smells smoke on his clothes. He tells Nick how dangerous drugs are and puts him in timeout. Nick agrees not to try marijuana again. Daisy, Nick's younger sister, is born right after Nick finishes middle school. Nick hangs out with kids who are obviously stoners in high school, and he gets suspended for buying marijuana on campus. Because of this, he is given a mentor named Dawn, who also likes to surf. Nick gets back on the right track with the help of Dawn, who gets him on the swim and water polo teams. Nick writes for the school paper as well. Nick goes to Paris for a French language program the summer after his junior year. He comes back with a stomach ulcer. Later, it is revealed that he was getting drunk almost daily. Dawn leaves school, and Nick quits his sports teams and the newspaper. David sees that Nick is getting high more often and more openly, but he doesn't know what to do. He thinks that telling Nick he can't have friends or do drugs will only make him want them more. Nick is even arrested for not going to court after he was given a ticket for having marijuana. David pays for his bail because he hopes that this will teach him a lesson. Nick decides to go to college at UC Berkeley, but he soon feels down and tells David that he's not ready for college. Nick goes back home with plans to take some time off and apply to a smaller East Coast college. Nick goes missing in the middle of the night a few months after he gets back home. After 4 days, Nick gives David a call. Nick is high on meth when David picks him up in an alley. He has a fever and is rambling. David is shocked to hear that Nick used meth, which is a very dangerous drug. Charles, one of David's best college friends, also used drugs, including meth, and David frequently joined him. Charles died the night before he turned 40 from liver and kidney failure, so David is very upset about Nick's drug use. David tells us that meth is quickly absorbed by the body, gives a euphoric high, and stays in the body for 10 to 12 hours. But it lowers the amount of neurotransmitters in the brain, which makes people feel bleak, tired, and angry after using it. At the time Beautiful Boy was written, there were 35 million people around the world who used meth. This was compared to 15 million cocaine users and 7 million heroin users. Meth use is also on the rise, and it often leads to tweaking, which includes hearing and seeing things that aren't there and acting aggressively and violently. David wants Nick to go to rehab, but Nick doesn't want to. Nick then goes missing again toward the end of spring. David doesn't know what to do now that Nick is gone. A week later, Nick comes back to the house, but he is no longer the same ghost. David looks for a rehab program and tells Nick that he has to go to rehab if he wants to live in the house or get help paying for college. Nick is angry and doesn't want to go to Olhoff Recovery in San Francisco, but he agrees to. Nick stays there for a month. When his time is up, he asks to work and be on his own instead of going back to college. He moves into a halfway house at the center, but he disappears again 3 days later. David does the same things every time Nick goes missing. He calls hospitals, the police, and Jasper and Daisy to try to explain what Nick is going through. He even drives all over San Francisco to try and find Nick. After a few days, David hears from Nick, who says he has been sober for 5 days but is obviously lying. Nick looks terrible and has a cut on his forehead when David picks him up. David signs Nick up for a program at St. Helena Hospital in Napa Valley and tells Nick that he can either go to rehab or live on the streets. Nick agrees to go back to rehab. David and Karen meet with their family at St. Helena. In one, a lecturer talks about the disease model of addiction, which says that addiction is just like any other disease. Addiction is partly caused by genes. Addicts are responsible for their own recovery and getting the treatment they need, but they did not cause their disease. David and Karen also meet with Nick in groups to hear how other people have dealt with addiction. Nick then says quickly that he's sorry for everything. Nick finishes the program and then asks to go back to school. In the fall, he goes to Massachusetts to attend Hampshire College. He agrees to find a 12-step meeting and work with a sponsor there. Nick starts using again after a month, but he quickly stops himself from having a full-blown relapse. After the spring semester is over, he goes home. But a few days after he gets back to school, he says that he used the whole spring semester. He takes $8 from 8-year-old Jasper's savings and then leaves. David and Karen still go to meetings, and David blames himself for what is going on. He is worried that the divorce or telling Nick about his own drug use led to Nick's addiction. Nick shows up at the house of Nancy and Dawn, Karen's parents, sleeping under a pile of blankets and high. He stays there for a while, but then he goes away again. A few nights later, Nick goes back to his house to look for something in his room, but David can't get him to stay. Nick's 20th birthday is the next day. In the days that followed, David felt sick every time the phone rang. He is worried and can't fall asleep. David tells Vicky to say no when Nick asks her for money. Nick goes to dinner with Vicky's family friends, who suggest that he stay with them in New York while he detoxes. Nick agrees, so he moves into an apartment in Brooklyn and starts seeing a psychiatrist. The psychiatrist gives him medicine to help him stay away from drugs. David finds out around this time that Nick has been making fake checks out of David's account. Soon after that, David finds out that Nick was rushed to the emergency room and is now on life support. He gets better, and David helps him get into another rehab program in New York called Hazelden. After this program, Nick moves back to Los Angeles and starts working with Randy, his new AA sponsor. Nick will be 21 in June, and in September, he will have been sober for a year. 6 months later, Nick stops answering David's calls, and David soon finds out that no one has seen him in days. Nick's girlfriend, Z, tells Vicky that Nick called her while he was high from San Francisco. David is both upset and tired from trying to find Nick. Nick is gone for a few weeks, and one day David and Karen find out that Nick broke into their house and the house of some family friends. 3 days later, Nick calls David, who suggests that Nick go back to Los Angeles and call Randy. Nick agrees, and David hopes this nightmare will soon be over. He tries to figure out how to stop worrying all the time because he knows it makes him weak. After 2 months, David goes to LA to see Nick. Nick says sorry again, and David is again cautiously optimistic, hoping that Nick can stay in recovery. Nick also sends Jasper a letter, telling him he wants to be there for him and giving back the $8 he stole. In February 2005, David writes a story about his family for the New York Times Magazine. He and Nick both start writing books about their lives after hearing what other people think. Then, in June, David has a hemorrhage in his brain. He stays in the hospital for more than a week and can't remember his own name. However, he keeps worrying about Nick. He slowly gets better, and then he realizes that his kids will be okay whether he is there or not. He worries all the time, but it doesn't help Nick. Instead, it hurts David and the rest of his family. At the end of that summer, Nick calls David to tell him that he's high again after being clean for almost 2 years. David tries to let go and just prays that Nick will get better. Nick hangs out with Z. For weeks, getting high, asking for money, and making up stories about where he is. Nick tries to break into Vicky's garage and fill shopping bags with things, but he accidentally locks himself inside. Vicky and David try to get him to go back to rehab, and he agrees. Nick goes to Santa Fe for one more program. David and Vicky come to see him for the weekend. It's the first time since they got divorced that they've been in the same room for more than 5 minutes. They go to group therapy sessions together. In one session, Nick says that he is trying to heal and not make excuses or blame others for things he did wrong. David thinks it's a miracle that he and Vicky are both there, and he wonders if it's too much to ask for Nick to stay healthy as well. David ends his story by telling other people to talk to their kids about drugs early and often, to go to Al-Anon meetings, and to err on the side of caution when it comes to knowing if their kids are trying drugs. He tells family members to be kind to themselves and not blame themselves for what is happening. David also talks about how the U.S. drug policy needs to be changed. He calls for more money to be spent on research and treatments. He also talks about how important it is to stop treating addiction like a moral failing and instead treat it like a disease that needs to be treated.
About the author. Sheff was born in Boston, Massachusetts, and went to the University of California at Berkeley to get his degree. After that, he started a long career as a journalist. He has written for the New York Times, Rolling Stone, Playboy, Wired, Fortune, and All Things Considered on NPR. Nick, his son, was born in July 1982. He and his first wife, Vicky, got a divorce in 1985, and in 1989, Sheff married Karen Barber. In December 1993, he and Karen had a son named Jasper, and in June 1996, they had a daughter named Daisy. Sheff wrote a story called My Addicted Son about Nick's drug use and published it in the New York Times Magazine on February 6, 2005. The article was well received, which led Sheff to write Beautiful Boy. Since then, he has written a number of other books about his own life and Nick's addiction. Sheff lives in San Francisco, California, at the moment.
Hope we summarized it fully and you liked it. Please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel so that we are motivated to create more videos.